Does the church believe in a God of freedom, like the Exodus story tells us? Does the church believe in a God of justice, like the prophets demand? Does the church believe in a God of equality, like Jesus and Paul were so clear on? Does the church really believe what our sacred scriptures call us to believe? And if we believe them, are we willing to act on them? This is a moment of truth. Is the church truly the church, and will it be the church in this moment?
Greetings, everyone. My name is Michael Spath, and I'm the Executive Director of the Indiana Center for Middle East Peace in Fort Wayne, Indiana. We're a voice of conscience for peace, justice, human rights, and intercultural encounter. I'm also on the boards of Friends of Hebron with Isa Amro and ICAD USA with Jeff Halper. From November 10th to 16th, more than 300 Palestinians and internationals from 23 countries gathered in Bethlehem for the 16th annual conference hosted by Kairos Palestine and the Global Kairos for Justice Coalition. At the conference, Kairos Palestine issued a new call to Christian churches around the world, as well as to all people of conscience and goodwill. A moment of truth, faith in the time of genocide. To discuss that today, we have our three guests. Rifat Kassis is not feeling well, so we have the privilege of hosting Munther Isaac, pastor of Hope Lutheran Church in Ramallah, and the director of the Bethlehem Institute of Peace and Justice. Allison Tanner is a Baptist pastor and is national organizer of the Apartheid-Free Communities Initiative. David Wildman is consultant and main representative to the United Nations Global Ministries United Methodist Church. Welcome to you all. So I want to get right into this. We're at day 802 since October 7th, 2023. I just want to say that as a matter of context. But I want to talk specifically about the recent Kairos Palestine conference in Bethlehem and this call to the church, the second Kairos Palestine document, the one titled A Moment of Truth, Faith in a Time of Genocide. It says this very clearly. Israel is a colonial, settler, and exclusionary entity built upon the displacement of the indigenous population and its replacement with new settlers. This document is called A Moment of Truth. Why is it a moment of truth? Munther?
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. And thank you for hosting this webinar. This is a moment of truth because we are making this cry from Palestine in a post-genocide era, even though we're not really sure that genocide has ended. I mean, even today, people were killed, and people are still killed from the severe weather conditions. It's a Kairos moment, a moment of truth, because if I'm not mistaken, this is the first time in history we watch genocide unfold in front of our eyes for 2 full years. No one can claim we did not know. No one can even claim we did not know about the severity of the killing. It's not as if we discovered the horrors afterwards. We could have stopped it, but there was not enough will among policymakers, and even, unfortunately, in some instances, the churches, to do what they can to stop it. And given that this is a genocide in which the Bible was invoked, biblical verses, biblical themes, by both Zionist and Christian Zionists, and then it lasted for 2 hours. We all watched it. This is a Kairos moment. This is a time for repentance. This is a time for confession. And this is a time we speak truth and really come with this reckoning that the notion of never again has become yet again. And this time we watched it live.
Thank you. Yeah, Allison?
Well, I want to add to that that this is a moment of truth for the church. Does the church believe in a God of freedom, like the Exodus story tells us? Does the church believe in a God of justice, like the prophets demand? Does the church believe in a God of equality, like Jesus and Paul were so clear on? Does the church really believe what our sacred scriptures call us to believe? And if we believe them, are we willing to act on them? This is a moment of truth. Is the church truly the church, and will it be the church in this moment?
David?
Yeah, thanks. I'll just add, since a large part of my work is in relation to the United Nations, that this is a moment of truth for the so-called the international framing of a Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Convention on the Prevention of Genocide. It's not just the punishment, but the prevention, and that not only have we failed to stop it, but to prevent further atrocities that, throughout these last 2 years, but also it was the failure of the international community and the world governments and the failure of churches to stop decades of displacement and denial of rights to Palestinian refugees, of decades of occupation. And so I just want to make sure that while we acknowledge October 7th as a significant date, there are decades of repression and oppression and dispossession of Palestinians that the world has refused to fully acknowledge and do something about.
You know, in this particular document, I sense a real sense of urgency. David, in a previous meeting, you mentioned that when you were at the conference, while the Western Church is twiddling its thumbs, and while we're talking about normalization here, in America, your Palestinian friends told you they talked about the future in months, not in years. You remember that conversation? And so I want the three of you to talk about the sense of urgency in this moment. So David, why don't you kick it off, and then Allison, and then Munther.
Yeah, I think I kind of feel like if we've had wildfires recently in the United States and North America, and when wildfires are raging, it's not the time to discuss, like, let's bring out Smokey the Bear and have a fire safety prevention course. That's very important. We shouldn't, but we need to stop immediately the crisis right now. As Munther was saying, that this is like televised, it's on social media, it's accessible everywhere, and yet the powerful have been systematically trying to block it. And so I think the urgency here is that the genocide is ongoing and expanding. Like we look for quick fixes. And the Bible in Jeremiah, in the Psalms, several places said, not all those who say peace, peace, when in fact there is no peace. In fact, there's just reducing, we can celebrate. Yes, there's less killing, but less killing is not ending the killing. And churches should never be content. Activists should never be content. And frankly, government should never be content with things just being reducing in this incremental approach. And it's not just Gaza, but across the West Bank, where people are being displaced and attacked by settlers multiple times every day. And yet, and I'll just say the other thing that I think is urgent about this is that for years, when things have erupted in the most violent way in Gaza, and there's been so-called ceasefires in Operation Cast Lead back in 2008, in the Great March of Return in 2018, there was never a ceasefire that applied to the West Bank. It was only maybe in Gaza, and it was never fully implemented. And so the West Bank is the conditions are being made unlivable for Palestinians in like meter by meter, expanding that. And meanwhile, we're talking about sort of, well, let's do an educational program at our local church. And so that's where the urgency is. Just there's a complete disconnect between where we are in the churches oftentimes in terms of our activism and where the situation on the ground is.
Well, it really impressed me when you said that your friends in Palestine, when they looked into the future, it wasn't years, it was months. So I've remembered that. Allison, please, and then Munther.
And while we were there, Kairos Palestine released a video called "The Silent Genocide." If what's happening in Gaza is writ large for everyone to see, the intensification of the violence and truly of the genocidal practices goes much less under the radar. And even if the killings are going down in Gaza, in the West Bank, they continue to rise. And the intensification of the attacks on individuals, on communities, on entire villages, the home demolitions, the raids, the terror, all of that has intensified exponentially. And it's not like that hasn't been the reality throughout the existence of the West Bank, but the way in which it's happening now in a way that is engaged with impunity and so rapidly intensifying gives you real fear for the amount of damage that will be done before Israel is stopped. And because of that, there is a real urgency because lives are at stake, because lands are at stake, because entire villages are at stake right now.
Munther? Munther, you're muted. There you go.
I mean, just yesterday, a Palestinian teenager was killed by settlers in Bethlehem, in the village of near Bethlehem. So I was saying that yesterday, a 16-year-old boy was killed in Tekoa near Bethlehem because what's happening in the West Bank has become a daily occurrence of settlers killing Palestinians protected by the army. And I wouldn't really, say the word urgent because if we're talking about Gaza, it's already too late. What's been lost has been lost. We failed. And is there any real will to stop it from happening again in Bethlehem? If there is anything the world, I hope, takes from Kairos too, is that while Palestinians are resilient, we're not asking the world to admire our resilience, but to act. And rather than talk, is it urgent? Is it how to respond? I mean, the only appropriate response right now is engage in boycotting and sanctions, in doing anything possible to stop this madness from continuing. And sadly enough, the Palestinians are the ones who are being sanctioned rather than the state that committed war crime. So I don't know what's the right word. Is it urgent? Is it because really I don't know what's there to rescue, and it seems that things keep getting worse and worse. And to me, this is going back to the first question. This is a moment of truth in which I hope we will look back in history and ask, what did we say? What did we do? Where were we? Did it happen under our watch? At least I hope they say they spoke up. They spoke the truth even at a cost. So rather than urgency, I would say this is a time to act, to speak in conviction, and really take a stand in this very crucial moment in history.
The document calls out, quote, the hypocrisy of the Western world. I've been saying that Christian nationalism is to Christianity as Zionism is to Judaism, that genocide is a natural outgrowth of both of these triumphalist, exceptionalist, racist ideologies, Christian nationalism and Zionism. So it frustrates me that while many liberals rightly protest what's happening in our country in the No Kings protests and others, Zionism seems to get a pass. We've been reluctant to call out Zionism as racism. It's past time. So your thoughts, David, then Munther, and then Allison.
Well, I think we need to remember that this was a country that was, the United States was a country built on by settlers taking land and engaging in a systematic, prolonged genocide against Native peoples across the continent. And so, if we're reluctant to acknowledge that past, we're also reluctant to acknowledge we're still doing the same thing. And that white supremacy and this colonial mindset that there is good violence versus bad violence, and the sacred violence that God endorses of us, of white nationalist Christians, Christian nationalists, is bringing forth the kingdom in this horrendous. I mean, it's a heretical sense, and we need to condemn it even more than we have. And then any resistance to that is a resistance to the gospel in this warped theology. So we need to keep calling that out, but we have a shameful, shameful history, and the church was complicit in much of the genocide against Native peoples and the enslavement of African Americans. And so when you have those deep, deep roots, they have not gone away, and we've not fully confronted them in U.S. Christian churches, and therefore it's not surprising. It's also not excusable that we failed yet again in relation to Palestine.
Munther?
Yeah, to answer your question, Michael, I think it's really important to emphasize that when we talk about coloniality, supremacy, racism, they are not confined to one school of thought, as if to the right versus the left. Everybody, in the empire, right or left, has these tendencies. The most obvious example is that it was the most progressive, liberal churches that for years lectured the world, especially us in the global south, on human rights, on gender justice, on sexuality, on the environment, and dictated us, human rights conventions, values, international law. They turned a blind eyes purposefully. It's not a matter we didn't know. They knew too well about all the crimes that were happening in Gaza and they said nothing. In fact, they defended them. We're so fast to point the finger at conservative, maybe fundamentalist Christian nationalism. Let's not forget that the same, elements of racism, supremacy, superiority against Palestinians and others, but we're talking here about Gaza in particular and Palestine, exist in also liberal camps. And that's why Kairos 2 is important, because it talks about it addresses both and it names them. It doesn't just, because we're accustomed about talking on Christian Zionism, Michael, as a right-wing phenomenon. And Kairos Palestine refuses that as if classification, because we've seen for too many years, many progressive liberal people who support Zionism get themselves off the hook by saying, oh, we're not Christian Zionists. And Kairos 2 is very clear in its language.
Allison?
I just want to thank you both. I think one of the things that this moment is making abundantly clear for those who haven't been able to connect the dots before, that not only was this country founded on colonization, that colonization is alive and well, and Christianity continues to legitimize it. And that is what we are being called to challenge. And one of the ways in which colonialism works is to mark out exceptionalism. And so this idea that the United States is exceptional, this idea that Israel is exceptional, these are exactly the mechanisms of colonialism that quite frankly our faith demands we challenge, even though our faith is being co-opted to legitimize them in very false ways.
It strikes me, Munther, that your reminder to us is really important. I mean, to criticize the religious right, and evangelicals, that's easy pickings these days. I mean, that's low-hanging fruit. It's the progressive churches and progressives politically in our country that I've been going after, progressives like myself, for example, and my friends. These are the people that we need to somehow mobilize. We know where the religious right is going to end up. So I don't know if any of the three of you want to pick up on that and say a further word, but that's where my heart is, and that's where my message has been most recently. Any of you want
Yeah.
to pick up on that? Go ahead,
I mean,
Winter.
just quickly, I mean, I mentioned churches, but let's also mention politicians in the
Absolutely.
United States. Um, even when a certain politician gives a 25 hours talk in the Congress, talking on every agenda that is on the globe and in the United States, yet fails to mention a genocide that was unfolding with his own tax money and his own votes, because he always votes for Israel. That tells you everything about the state, because even the liberals want an empire to expand, or need an empire to expand their so-called liberal exceptional values, and they might classify them as liberal and base them as we're not on the right, but at the end of the day they're using the mechanism of empire, alliances of empire, money, APAC money, and so on, and vote for Israel while claiming to hold liberal values. So let's remember that it's also politicians who do that same thing.
Yeah, I think you're referring to Cory Booker. Yeah, Allison, or do you want to jump in here, and then David?
And I mean, I want to add U.S. media as well, that there is such a
Absolutely.
pro-Israel bent in the United States that our politician, our media, our faith have just consumed this message and are sharing it out. And we are really in a situation now that you cannot be neutral on Israel. To be silent on Israel is to support the status quo, but it's also to perpetuate this pro-Israel mentality that even in our thinking, it's so pervasive that unless we are actively challenging any type of pro-Israel bent in our theology, in our politics, in our media, then that bent is not going unchecked. I mean, it's internal, it's in the water that we breathe, and that there really is a need to be anti-Christian Zionist, anti-Zionist in the United States if you want to even rise above the harm that's being committed, let alone challenging it and naming it.
Yeah, thanks, Allison. David, you want to weigh in?
I'll just a couple things. I think this points to what we need to distinguish is the gap between the powerful leadership in any particular political ideology or theology and the grassroots. Because I think the progressive grassroots on campuses and in the Jewish community, the Muslim community, like in churches, is quite active, and it's not done. None of us have done enough yet to stop the genocide. And yet there's tremendous activism at the grassroots, but the political powerful in progressive circles, as in Congress, the elected officials, but also wealthy donors that donate to lots of liberal democratic causes, nevertheless line up with other powerful. And I think that Advent is a great reminder of that's not where Emmanuel came. God with us came into the context of the oppressed and the marginalized, not the powerful. And that got the powerful upset. And a couple of weeks ago, we marked, there's always John the Baptist in Advent as one of the scripture readings. And John the Baptist was pretty harsh on the scribes and Pharisees, the religious leaders that came out and wanted to claim his prophetic message, but not his prophetic practice. And so I would say that as we look at this, it's not just kind of bash or blame, but be clear that we're blaming the progressive elites and powerful, that they're not listening to the base.
You all referred to the West Bank earlier, and I want to just give you a chance to say more about that. Our hearts and minds are focused on Gaza rightly, but as the document details, there's a relentless genocide taking place in the West Bank. and it discusses various issues. So it calls out political division, daily life under military occupation, emigration and brain drain, the challenge to the churches in Palestine, and more. So, Munther, you're there. I mean, and Allison and David, you were just there. Munther, you're living there and ministering to people under these pressures. Pick one of them or two and say a word about them. Yeah, there you go.
And I'm gonna, I hope no one thinks I'm trying to sound dramatic, but maybe the most accurate description of what's happening in the West Bank now, and you can check the facts, you can go read the news, you can study the history, is that what's happening in the West Bank today is exactly what was happening in Gaza 20, 25 years ago, building the base of a siege. The difference is that they're not building the siege around the entire West Bank, but around the cities in the West Bank. So Ramallah is isolated, Bethlehem is isolated, and they're pushing now. After they've isolated the cities, now they can attack the villages because they're isolated. And with no line of defense, you can't actually defend yourself. You'll be shot by the soldiers. And the idea is to push people from the village to the city into the big prison. And actually, sadly, it's working. I know several families that left villages to come and live in the West Bank out of fear for their lives. In particular, I'm talking to their cars were burnt and they almost lost their homes when they were burnt by settlers. And if it happens once, twice, three times, in the end you think, I have children, I'd rather go to live in Ramallah rather than, and Ramallah is being invaded almost on a daily basis anyway. And if now Israel closes 2 checkpoints in Bethlehem, for example, Bethlehem becomes another Gaza, completely isolated from the world. These are not the checkpoints that take us to Jerusalem, but the checkpoints that separate Bethlehem from the south, Hebron. And of course, you go through a checkpoint, then through settlers, roads shared by the settlers, then into Hebron. And the same, you go from the north through a container checkpoint, we call it. And then from there to Ramallah using the roads that the settlers use. So Israel is building the infrastructure for the fragmentation of Palestinians into isolated communities, big prisons. They can control us, they can control the movement. It's common now to be stuck at a checkpoint for 3 hours, 2 hours, 4 hours, 6 hours, 7 hours, harassed at the checkpoint. It's becoming common, and the settlers' attacks as well. They are pushing us out of the West Bank one family at a time. That's what's happening right now.
Allison?
So while I was in the West Bank, I had a chance to go to high school and talk to some high school students about their existence and what it means to live under this apartheid regime. And and they talked about what it feels like. I mean, we specifically talked in their bodies. What does it feel like to know that your friends have been taken by the military and that you could be taken too? What does it mean that your phone could be confiscated at any time and that could reveal that you could end up being imprisoned? What does it mean when your father is a journalist and you don't know any single night that whether or not he's going to come home or not? So how does this feel, and the power of this restriction of movement in this moment really hit home to me. I asked them, what would life be like if the occupation ended tomorrow? And every single one of them said, every single one of them had a connection to movement. One said, I would get to see my family again, my family who's in the West Bank that I don't get to see. One said, I'd get to see Jerusalem. One said, I'd get to go over to Lid, where I could see the ancestral home of my grandparents and they could take me there again. One said, I would actually get to see Palestinian landscape and nature that I'm only reading about in books but can't go to. And so you have just these layerings of impact on everyday life that so restrict and confine. And these are folks who are growing up in the city, so haven't been forced to move, but even their ability to connect with even the larger West Bank has been so restricted.
David?
Yeah, I'll just add to that I think that one of the fundamental problems for those of us in the United States and in Europe is this individualizing blame, complicity when it comes to the oppressors, but collectivizing blame when it comes to Palestinians. And what I mean by that is that each village that we visited, where settlers were attacking each and every day and displacing, as Munther and Allison have mentioned, they couldn't have done that without soldiers of the Israeli military being present and supporting and protecting them. They couldn't have done it without the fact that their settlements all had, even the outposts, had electricity and water and roads that were all provided by the Israeli state. So there was systemic oppression. But the Biden administration wanted to suggest that all of this, the only problem was 5 settlers that they had found that were violent. And it's like, wait a minute, like over half, over 60% or more of the land of the West Bank and expanding is controlled because of the violence of 5 guys. And I've talked with folks at European missions at the UN, and the same thing is, well, we have sanctions against a number of settlers and even some settler organizations, but they still refuse to acknowledge that the member state, the government that they trade with and are happy to have good relations with, is engaged in a systematic project here, as Munther has outlined, and pretend like they can separate that out between and just look at a couple in bad apples, as it were.
Munther, you want to jump in
David,
here? Yeah,
can I
go ahead,
just jump
Munther.
into that?
Please,
Of course, it was the Biden administration that celebrated that, and it was a joke. I told them it was a mockery. But how is that different, David? You tell me, from churches that boycott settlement goods.
Exactly.
How is that different? Come on. Because that's, again, churches that want to come across as progressive, as pro-Palestine, pro-justice, and they say we boycott settlement goods, but not those who, the system, the structure of apartheid that enables these settlements. I mean, that's the problem we've been facing. So thank you for raising that up.
I think absolutely it's way overdue for churches to say we need to boycott Israel, the state of Israel, and as an entirety until it changes its behavior. And that fits with the widow and the unjust judge. She demanded a change of behavior and kept at it. And churches have too often chosen the comfortable route rather than the prophetic and truthful, just route.
Go ahead, Allison.
And just to expand on this, yes, there's the need to boycott Israel, but one of the things that the new Kairos document makes clear is that there's a need to boycott dialogue. There is a need to boycott Zionism. There's a need to boycott any conversations about Palestine and Israel that refuse to name the injustices taking place, the vast inequality, and the ways in which Israel is engaging in war and crimes. So the level of accountability to our actions goes beyond just our boycotting of what we purchase. It goes to boycotting theology. It goes to boycotting politicians. It goes to boycotting any narratives that continue to be preventative of justice coming to pass.
It was important, I think, this document, that it discussed normalization. The mainstream press in the U.S. has moved on from genocide in Gaza and the West Bank. I mean, there are other things, right? We don't hear it talked about much anymore in the U.S. press, even the mainstream press, even on the so-called progressive news stations. Normalization, Jeff Halper predicted at the beginning of the genocide, would be the death of Palestinians. Normalization would be the death of Palestinians. So I want you to talk about the normalization that's taking place and what we can do to counteract it. And Allison, why don't you start?
Well, so this is where I just mentioned this need to boycott dialogue that among Israelis and Palestinians that doesn't address injustice, boycott any type of theology And what that means in the churches is that when we hear from our sister churches any theology that has this elevation of Israel, or that simply refuses to acknowledge the great harm that's being done by Israel, that we have an obligation to speak up. And to say that actually is not the story. That actually is the narrative that you are telling is causing great harm because it's preventing us from doing what we can to help ensure that that the mighty are being brought down and the lowly are being elevated. And that's where David, you talked about the Advent story that God is born among the oppressed. Yes, absolutely. But we know from Mary's Magnificat that God isn't just born among the oppressed, that God is actively at work bringing down the mighty and lifting up the lowly. And if the church isn't doing that work, then we are allowing injustice to continue.
Yeah, thank you for that, Allison. David, normalization.
Yeah, I think one of the things that struck me the most was when we visited Ras Al Osha and some of the other villages. We met with a couple of Israelis that were there from Jewish Israelis that were joining and trying to protect the communities. And they talked about co-resistance. And so I think it's really important to understand the difference between like working together if one's resisting oppression is not normalization. That's trying to defeat normalization is accepting the oppression and pretending there are individual approaches that one can take. And so I think in resisting normalization, we need to lift up co-resistance of how is it we've joined together. And here I think the African National Congress and the anti-apartheid movement described themselves as a non-racial movement for South Africa that was free and equal for all South Africans. And if folks could join that, so the predominantly white Communist Party in South Africa was part of the African National Congress. And people didn't like to think about that because in the US, we're so identity focused. And that's the deep white supremacist racism within the churches. But the second thing I'll say is that the BNC, the Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions National Committee of the Palestinians, has been very clear from the beginning that boycotts are not, like the academic boycotts are not of individual professors or faculty or students, as offensive as some of their speech might be. It's about institutions and about systemic oppression. And I think that's what folks want to avoid, is it raising those systemic questions, because when you look at the systemic genocide, settler colonialism and oppression and apartheid against Palestinians, the complicity of US churches, the complicity of US corporations and the US government becomes clear as day. And therefore, we need to confront the Christian metaphor from the Bible, the log in our own eye. And we don't want to look at the log in our own eye. We want to look at those specks here and there that we can kind of nitpick about.
Munter?
Michael, let's just also clarify something, that the document talks clearly about boycotting Christian Zionist dialogue, not Christian Jewish dialogue. We make a clear distinction between dialoguing with Zionists, and that includes Christians and Jews, and dialoguing with, as David said, working together with Jews who oppose Zionism with us. And second, that we are clear that boycotting is a tool. It's not an end in itself. But I want to talk about normalization from the perspective of Palestinians. You know how many times I've given talks to church groups and then be asked, so tell us about your relationship with your Israeli neighbors and you who want to, because that's the first thing they want to see. I'm telling them, we live under apartheid. There's a genocide happening. We're being ethnically cleansed. This is what's happening. And you're asking me, so are you talking to your oppressor? And I, before the war even, used to use the metaphor in which someone is literally stepping at our necks and with their boots. And then some are telling us, why don't you talk I mean, yeah, I'll talk if you lift the boot from my neck first and restrain the person who's oppressing me. And that's why right now, I mean, it's really offensive. It's really an insult to our suffering when you talk about reconciliation or about a dialogue or about if the only dialogue I want to have is how do we end up apartheid? How do we stop the genocide from spreading into the West Bank? And then we can talk about after we have justice, after we have accountability, reparations. Yes, let's talk about reconciliation. And the fact that many people are obsessed with this peace industry, even today, and again, you know, we need to be very cautious. Even the so-called eternal peace plan that was declared, the 20 points, which include many good things, by the way. I'm not ridiculing everything in it. And you know, at least it made the killing less intense. The killing is still happening. It has some good points, as I said, the 20 points of Trump. But there is an element, they added something about interfaith. As if the problem is, you know, people of different faiths cannot get along, you know. To me, the priority is not interfaith. The priority is ending apartheid together. And then we'll get along as people of different faiths, believe me. And we'll find ways. So yes, that's why we have a problem with normalization, because it's yet another tool under the banner of reconciliation to continue colonialism.
I mean, if
You know, go ahead, Allison. Yeah.
just if I could, the idea of normalization really connects to the idea of being colorblind, right? In the United States, to be a white person and to say you're colorblind is a way of saying, I don't want to name injustice, and I don't want to have to do the work of making sure that everyone is able to actually be on equal footing before we engage, and how do we all get along?
Thanks for that. You know, each one of the questions and answers has had a theological component, and of course, it doesn't surprise me because I know the three of you are deeply embedded in a liberation kind of theological movement. But I want to dig deep now into the theology. So the document is strong in its call for a global theological movement built on the pillars of God's kingdom, rejecting the oppression and injustice produced by the theology of racism, colonialism, and ethnic supremacy embodied in Christian Zionism. We heard that in just a couple of weeks ago, over 1,000 American evangelical ministers and Christian influencers gathered in Israel at a Friends of the Zion Ambassadors Summit. So I want you to talk to us about how, I mean, this should go without saying, but talk to us about why theology is not just merely church talk, right? But theology really is a matter of life and death, and why theology matters in terms of life and death. Munther, please, and then Allison, and then David.
You know, you mentioned the 1,000, and I can't just bypass them. Let's just pause for a moment before asking and to illustrate why theology is important. You have 1,000 people paid by a government that just committed war crimes, at least in a genocide, in our estimation. Not just our estimation, it's well documented. You know, some American friends of mine are saying they should register as foreign agents, you know, foreign lobbyists. They are.
Absolutely.
And they come to Palestine and could care less about meeting Palestinian Christians. What matters more to them, their allegiance, is not to the kingdom of God, nor to their siblings, nor to the body of Christ. Their allegiance is to empire. It's as simple as that. And that's why it becomes crucially important today to preach, to teach a theology of the kingdom of God that challenges empire, a theology of a kingdom that rose in the midst of empires to counter, as a shadow empire, if you wish, a shadow kingdom, to counter, to provide an alternative to the ways of might is right. I love to call it a kingdom of the meek, kingdom of meekness, not might makes right. The kingdom where justice and righteousness are the basis of peace, not might again. A kingdom of God where, as the Virgin Mary sang in her beautiful song, which Alison just mentioned, there's an upside down toward order. Those who sit on the thrones will be dethroned, and those who are lowly will be uplifted. And that's a kind of theology that we need to discover, which is opposite to the empires of liberalism or that of Christian nationalism. It's a totally different set of values that's based on humility, on meekness, on love, on compassion, on mercy, foundations of truth and justice. Read the Beatitudes, read the teachings of Jesus. We need theology. We need to rediscover the teachings of Jesus and make sure they apply in the public square. I'm tired of Christians who, I'm sorry to say, think that violence is always the solution. They are obsessed with violence. I write about it in the book. This obsession with violence. What happened to the Jesus we worship who said, turn the other cheek? I can't fathom it. Oh, it doesn't apply on the public square. So what, was Jesus delusional? Was he a naive idealist? And that's the savior we worship? Come on. So we need a true revival in our theology and a discovery of the theology of the kingdom of God.
Alison?
And absolutely. And let me just underscore, when you ask the question, what does God call us to do? Or how does God call us to live? Theology determines the answer to that question. So theology matters because it shapes how we understand our responsibility to our neighbors, to our global kin. Our theology shapes how we interact with the world, and how we interact with the world has the ability to change the material conditions of suffering. So that's why theology matters.
Yeah, David, theology, a matter of life and death.
Yeah, I think, the church, again, I mentioned earlier the gap between the sort of political, economic, powerful and the grassroots. There's the same gap exists in the churches. And there are too many bishops and pastors who want to be court prophets, which means they're close to power and rub shoulders with the powerful, and somehow that will make them more important in people's eyes as opposed to in God's eyes. And so I think we need to always challenge this, the court prophet syndrome of leadership. And court prophets invariably offer smooth words to the powerful and a more blame the victim approach to those that are oppressed and marginalized in our society. And so it's no accident that they would say smooth words and nice things about Israel, about the US government, and blame Palestinians for all the problems. It's horrendous. So the other thing I think, Mutter and Alison have already touched upon the sort of the sacralizing or sanctifying of violence. And somehow that violence is redemptive. And I think that really has to be challenged. But violence is very quick. And in our high-tech society, we're used to quick information. We can get information very quickly, and including through social media, we've been able to see what's happening in Gaza far more quickly than in other genocides where it wasn't publicized. There weren't Palestinian filmmakers there and people using their phones. And so we want to celebrate the quickness of information, but not be naive to think that there's a quick solution. It still involves really hard work. And too often, the church wants the comfortable, quick route and sees violence as the quick answer, because you can break things really quickly, but you cannot rebuild as in the same way. And the last thing I'll say is that I've tried with churches to say, when they start like BDS won't work, that's provocative or whatever, and I say, well, fine. what nonviolent strategies would you advocate? Are you going to go to the West Bank and be unarmed civilian protection and join with Palestinian communities to protect the villages? Great. You don't have to do BDS. Do that kind of unarmed civilian presence. Are you going to block congressional offices or block corporations or not pay your taxes? Fine, then you don't have to do BDS. But please tell me what nonviolent strategies you're engaged in. And in fact, usually there's silence at that point.
Palestinians have been resisting occupation and ethnic cleansing for, 70 plus years. And many of us have been about this work for decades. I know, David, you have spent much of your life, Alice said, me for 25 years or more. Yet things are getting worse. Genocide. When we gathered at the Carter Center in July, this Kairos Palestine document calls us, it demands, quote, a new stand unlike anything before it. So, what can we do differently that will be more effective than we've done in the past? This, quote, new stand. What's being asked of us as Christians, as churches, as human beings? And Munther, I don't think I've heard any time you've ever talked, you talk about costly solidarity. Costly solidarity. So Munther, why don't you begin? What new thing? What different? Tell us what we can do.
Yeah, thank you. Michael, I think it begins by acknowledging that everything we tried in the past did not work.
You said earlier that we
honest.
failed. We failed.
Yes, no, we failed, and the approaches of the past did not work. Let's be honest with ourselves. Let's stop pretending that we get it right. And I'm grateful David mentioned the example. Those who said, we can't be too aggressive. Let's not burn the bridges by talking about apartheid. I mean, did that work? Really, did that work? So let's begin by acknowledging that the ways of the past did not work, namely that of diplomacy, that of mediation. And the second reason is, the second thing, why did that not work? It's because churches in particular, and I'm very, very honest here and very direct, churches, and that's the importance of Kairos too. Churches have always had the wrong diagnosis, namely that of the empire, which is that there is a conflict, that basically Muslims can't get along with Jews, that we need to solve things by mediating or calling for Palestinians to accept the narrative of the Israelis and vice versa. That's why the problem is in our curriculum as Palestinians, in our education, what we teach our children, and we don't talk enough about peace. That's why how many times we've been invited to peace conferences, how many times we've been lectured on what peace looks like. Because again, churches, whether by choice or not, I'm not gonna say here as if everyone by choice, but churches have adopted the conflict narrative, and Kairos 2 is very strong, very strong, very clear. You can't be pro-justice if you use the conflict paradigm. It's settler colonialism and apartheid, and what happened in Gaza is genocide. If you're not willing to address reality for what it is, you can't move on. We can't be peacemakers, and you can't even, don't get engaged, because you're gonna just empower the oppressor. You might as well say, I am a Zionist, if you're not willing to address reality for what it is. And I think once we have that diagnosis, and once we acknowledge Zionism as racism, Zionism as a colonial theology of oppression, that's where the problem is, I think then we can move forward, because then we know what to condemn. We know what to boycott. We know that we cannot normalize the relationship with a genocidal entity, with an apartheid entity. The paradigm of conflict, releases you from the burden of having to boycott a genocidal state or an apartheid state, because it's a conflict. You don't boycott one side over the other because you have to be neutral. So that's why I say, and that's why Kairos was very strong in its analysis of the context. And I say that churches want to be released from the burden of, for example, boycotting an apartheid state. They'd rather normalize under the pretext of, it's a conflict and we have a relationship with both sides. That's where costly solidarity comes. Once you realize it's apartheid, and you know that the way to dismantle apartheid is by boycotting it, by demanding sanctions, you will be targeted. Are you willing to accept the price? Are you willing to suffer? Are you willing to say, I am in solidarity with Palestinians because the kingdom of God is that of the poor, of the oppressed, of the marginalized? It's not about something inherently righteous in us Palestinians. It's about taking a stand with justice, with righteousness. And so costly solidarity is so strongly tied with having the right diagnosis and with willingness to accept reality and address reality for what it is. And that's the most important, in my opinion, maybe that's the most important thing that Kairos Palestine brings to the table.
Allison and David, I'm gonna come to you in just a minute, and I've got one more question for the two of you. So hold on, because I know Munther, you and I have an agreement. You were very kind to step in for Rifat today. Our prayers are with Rifat. Please pass those along to him. I was in touch with him this morning. You postponed taking your family out on the town tonight to be with us. Do you have any parting words for us you'd like to share as we enter into this? We're in Advent season, as we enter into the Christmas season, and we're grateful for your witness to us.
Well, thank you. So the theme of this virtual meeting is Kairos 2, and it comes in a time of Advent. Kairos 2 was written in very difficult times. It was written with heavy emotions, but with, in my humble estimation, very clear theological clarity. And Kairos 2 calls for Christians around the world to discern the times. This is a Kairos moment. We're in Advent. It's a Kairos moment in that we're waiting the coming of Jesus, the coming of the child of God intervening in our history. And as Christians, we have to acknowledge that the intervention has taken place 2,000 years ago. We know God has shown us the way through Christ, and we need to respond. And in this particular moment, Palestinian Christians are making a plea to respond to the cries that we made in Kairos Palestine 1 and 2, but particularly in Kairos 2, given the anguish we went through just to write and discuss this document. Believe me, this was not an easy document to write, not because we couldn't agree on every detail in it. Yes, the discussions actually were fun, but because of the weight of the moment and because of the heaviness of the topic. So I urge you to read it, to respond, to share it, to read it prayerfully, and also to share it with your friends, with your pastors. As we sing, "O little town of Bethlehem," use it as a moment and say, by the way, have you read this document that was published in Bethlehem last month by Christians? And maybe the people who hear it will be surprised that Bethlehem actually exists, let alone that there are Christians in it. So let's use Christmas Advent to spread the news. And I thank everyone who will read and respond to that important document. So thank you.
Blessings to you, Munther, and thank you for your courage and for your strong call to us for costly solidarity. When I think of you, I think of that call for costly solidarity, and it challenges me. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Have a good day.
Thanks, Mother.
Allison and David, I have one more question for you, and that is, one of the ways, Allison, that we can stand with our Palestinian friends is through Apartheid-Free Communities Initiative. And you know a little bit about that. And so I want you to tell us about Apartheid-Free Communities Initiative and how we can be involved if we're not already.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to take the liberty of responding to what Munther just said just for a minute and
Please,
go into
absolutely.
it. Because Munther named clearly that what he thinks is the strongest part of the Kairos document is the theological framing. And for me, I don't want to negate Munther, so I'm not saying he's wrong, but for me, one of the most powerful part of the document is its very clear call to the church and giving the church very specific, tangible ways to take action. And so, as a summary of these specific ways to take action that the Kairos document names for the church, I'm just going to put those in the chat, read them, spend some time on them. We've discussed some of them in different ways throughout this call, but that piece of concrete ways in which the church, one, is called to act and two, is called not to act, are very important. And because one of the ways in which Kairos says very clearly in this new document that we are to act is to name the reality of the Palestinian condition using the words genocide, settler colonialism, and apartheid. This is where apartheid-free communities comes in as, again, a concrete way to respond to this call. And I'm going to put in the chat both the apartheid-free website and the text of the apartheid-free pledge that calls on communities of all types, and it specifically calls on congregations, Christian communities across the board, as well as interfaith communities and communities of conscience of all types to take a pledge that publicly names Israeli apartheid, that pledges to take action to cut ties with Israeli apartheid, whether it's cutting ties with the narratives of Israeli apartheid, the politics of Israeli apartheid, or the economics of Israeli apartheid, and then to become a part of the growing apartheid-free movement, which I am very excited to report on Sunday surpassed 1,000 communities. I believe we're at about 153 congregations. We just got a new synagogue and we just got a new masjid and a new church that I have to put on the website by the end of today. You'll be able to go to our website and see the list of all over 1,000 communities who have gotten together and taken this pledge, but specifically for the Christian communities, those who are part of this network gather once a month to strategize how we can really live out this pledge and how we can work together to cut all ties to Israeli apartheid, settler colonialism, and military occupation. If your community is not yet a part of apartheid free, and let me just say, if the multitude of communities that you are connected with are not yet part of apartheid free communities, I really encourage you to take the pledge to them to get your community having these very hard conversations and moving them forward, not only in educating them, but in empowering them to take action in this moment, this Kairos moment.
Thank you, Allison. It's very important. Indiana Center for Middle East Peace was one of the early signatories and, participants. David, as long as I've known you, you've been one of the strongest proponents of boycott, divestment, and sanctions. Why is BDS more important than ever now? In addition, for regular folks like me, in addition to simply boycotting certain products, how can people like myself increase our support for BDS?
Yeah, thanks, Michael, and thanks for the whole webinar and for all the folks that have been on the webinar. Really appreciate it. I think one of the things that BDS does is it makes it impossible to talk about a conflict that Munther mentioned earlier, but to say there's something systemic going on here of oppression, and there are violations of international human rights law. There's violations of Christian teachings, of the Ten Commandments. Almost every one of the Ten Commandments is violated by Zionism, by the way. Let me just say, that's another matter. So it shifts to ending complicity. So it's not enough to say like, oh, what you should do, like Israeli government, you should do this. Well, it's fine to point the finger, but prophetic action was what we must do to enable that change of behavior by the powerful, to end the oppression and the violence that they're practicing. And so I think that BDS is also something that I'm in New York. So, everybody talks about how do you get to Carnegie Hall? Practice, practice, practice. How do you get to liberation? Practice, practice, practice. So that BDS is something you don't do once. It's like, we issued our statement. We actually named genocide. No, churches need to practice, 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 accompanying and listening and working with our Palestinian sisters and brothers and working with co-resistors in the Israeli community, the few that are there. We need to practice wearing down the powerful, which is one of the examples of the widow. So BDS, I think, is one of the best forms of what I call a ministry of erosion, that you don't worry about like converting the powerful, but wearing them down. I think so often we do an educational seminar in our churches and go, if only my member of Congress saw this video, they would stop supporting oppression. They would stop sending arms. And it doesn't work that way. We need to wear them down and leave their conversion to God. We hope that God works in their heart. We hope that there's some kind of change of mind and change of spirit. But most importantly, and Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Movement was about, let's change the behavior of these folks. And so that's the challenge. I think also we're in a season of Advent, which is a season of waiting, but we misunderstand that notion of waiting because the powerful define waiting as it's not yet time for a Palestinian state. It's not yet time to end arms shipments. It's not yet time to cut off all relations with Israel to end the apartheid, the colonialism, the settler colonialism, and the genocide. But the waiting is like a farmer, the plowing of the field, the preparing of when things are ready. Because, when Jesus was born, God with us, Emmanuel, the empire was still there. There was still a lot of nasty stuff happening. But there was a change that was also taking place. And I think that what BDS does is invites us to be a part of that. And it's not like, well, I divested from Caterpillar, so we can go home. And I think every denomination that those of us who are Christians are a part of are struggling with that question of where next with BDS. And that's a good question. There's not one answer, but the answer is continue, persist with BDS. Don't just say, well, we've tried BDS, it didn't work, or we tried BDS and it worked on something. But we never know exactly. And this is where I go back to our South African colleagues in the struggle. In 1985, in the worst of the depth of the state of emergency in South Africa, no one in South Africa or in the international global growing anti-apartheid movement would have said that things would change as quickly as they did. They changed with a lot of violence. I don't want to pretend it was easy. There's still things to be done. But hope, and I think Kairos Palestine, the first document that talks about faith, hope, and love, reminds us to be faithful, to keep at it, whether it seems to be working or not, and to be hopeful, to say that, the change we want is beyond the horizon now, but it won't be that way forever. That God's not finished yet, and we're not finished yet. And then love is the Greek word for BDS, boycott, divestment, and sanctions. Those are loving actions. We don't do these out of vengeance or spite, but to say, if someone's engaged in bad behavior, we want to stop the bad behavior. And I think really embracing BDS as acts of Christian love is what Palestinians is such a powerful message to us, not only around Palestine, but around what's happening with ICE and immigration, what's happening about the gutting of government services to the poor and the impoverished in the United States, of cutting off U.S. aid and international programs. Like all of that, we need to understand that BDS, boycotts, are acts of love to restore our just relations, not just restore superficial relations.
Like I did with Munther, I'm going to give David and Allison the last word. But before I do, a reminder that, and it's in the chat room, I'm leading 2 trips in 2026. First in June, our 19th Solidarity Tour to Palestine, where we'll be visiting with Munther and I think 18 other justice advocates and peacemakers. And so note that, and if you're interested, contact me. And the second in late September, early October in South Africa, with Desmond Tutu colleague and anti-apartheid activist Reverend Edwin Arison, our fourth together in the footsteps of Desmond Tutu and Nelson Mandela, focusing on South Africa's support for Palestine. And we'll meet like we've been in the past. We'll meet with Alan Bosak and Frank Ciccone and others. Information is in the chat room. Please contact me if you're interested in either one of those trips. So, my friends, parting words. David and then Allison.
Well, a couple of things. I was just struck, we had a children's pageant where we try and retell the Advent story. We have lessons and carols. It's a wonderful way of retelling the story, but I suddenly heard parts of it in a new way. And that is like a tale of two enrollments when Luke talks about the whole world should be enrolled and go back to their home cities. That's what Palestinian refugees have been asking for nearly 80 years. We just want to be enrolled and be able to go home. But the powerful were like, no, wait a minute. Let's change this. We want you to move out of the way so we can tax and exploit the land of Gaza. So I invite you to be creative and just kind of use the horrors that are happening now to connect with some of the powerful biblical imagery that might guide us going forward. Then the second thing I'll say is it's frustrating. 2 years of activism. There's like amazing growth in the global Palestinian solidarity movement and folks really finally listening to Palestinians for the first time and not trying to tell Palestinians what to do or think we know best. And yet all of that together, the civil disobedience, the sort of BDS work that's happened, all of it together has not yet stopped the powerful and the horrors of genocide that are imposed on Palestinians. But we can't give up. And I know in many justice struggles, folks talk about like it's a marathon. And if you're like me, I'm like, I like to run, but like I'm not doing no marathon. That's not happening. And so I get disempowered before I've even started. That's too long a race. So I've invited folks to think about this struggle as a relay race, that we're a team. And if all of us are running at the same time, the relay race, the team is not going to do so well in the relay race. But we have different distances, and we need to be able to pass the baton for a moment when I've reached my limit to someone else. Palestinians don't have that luxury, but we need to understand that we need to stay in this with our colleagues, but sometimes there's this, even God rested one day in seven. And then last thing I'll invite you to say is something that stayed with me is Highlander Folk School that started in the 1930s and has done like amazing community organizing. And they actually were some of the folks that did trainings with Rosa Parks and the other civil rights leaders. And some of the folks from SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, went to Highlander and talked to Miles Horton, who was one of the founders. And he said, well, we can't work with you. And they said, why is that? It's like, well, we only do adult education. And so, of course, the predominantly African-American members of SNCC leadership who were in their 20s were like, what's this old white guy? Like, he's racist. And Miles said, no, my definition of an adult is someone who's been arrested. And he invited them to say, like, get out there and do something first. And then the dialogue is not a dialogue sort of platitudes and premature reconciliation. The dialogue is in the jail cell. The dialogue is on the streets when we're marching and protesting. And so I invite us all to join those dialogues of the streets. And as we do it, we'll gain strength from one another. And at some point, all of that will make a huge difference and end the horrors of genocide that we're facing today.
David, thanks for your strong words. Allison, you are coming to us. I don't know if you want to say much about it, but you're coming to us from your work yesterday. And so I don't know if you want to blend any of that experience with your closing words, but I invite you now for some parting words as well.
Well, I wasn't going to go there, but since you've opened
As,
the door,
as you
Michael.
like, as you like, Allison.
Yesterday, I was engaged in an arrestable offense trying to shut down ICE immigration headquarters in San Francisco. We were successful. And in the training 2 nights before, I remember, it was very organized. We all had the same stoles on. We all had very matching artwork. We wanted it to look really, really good. And I remember someone coming to me saying, "Am I allowed to wear my keffiyeh, or is that like mixing messages?" And how can wearing a keffiyeh when we're seeking to hold accountable our government be mixing messages? Because isn't this the work that we are called to do? The piece that I really want to close with in this Advent season of meditating, of pondering the incarnation and what that is, even as we one of the things that I'm always struck with, and was really when I read this second Kairos document with this very, very clear call to the churches, I was realizing this document is inviting the church to incarnate our faith anew, to birth new iterations of what it means to be followers of the God of freedom, justice, and equality. And even as we sing, "Oh, Little Town of Bethlehem," there's a line in that hymn that calls on God to be born in us anew. And that is what this document is asking as well. Can God be born in you, in us anew? And of course, people from Bethlehem know that incarnation is not just God coming with us, it's God being born among us, and the shepherds coming, and the magi coming, and people providing space and community, and people helping when the immigrant Holy Family was forced to flee. That each of these people were invited to be part of the incarnation story. And that's what Palestinians have asked us, to be a part of the incarnation story anew in this moment. And so I want to close with these words that I heard from the gathering that talk about the profound faith that Palestinians have and the requirement of us to partner with them. The words as I heard them at the conference: "We still believe that faith can move mountains, that truth can speak power, that love can rise from the ashes of genocide. But for this to happen, we're going to need your help."
David, Allison, you've blessed us today with your presence, and we're grateful to Munther too. Thank you for your courageous and bold, not only witness, but challenge to us as well.